Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm going to stall for a minute while I wait to make sure that everybody makes it in from the waiting room. Thank you all so much for joining us on a non-rainy evening for once. I hope you all had a chance to go outside today. Um, we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to get started in just a second, but it looks like everybody who's in the waiting room made it in, so we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to our webinar on charging on the go. This is our third webinar in a series all about electric vehicle charging. So hopefully you were able to join us for our charging basics and our charging at home webinars. Today it's all about charging on the go. If you're not familiar with us here at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we are a nonprofit organization doing work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And our mission is all about empowering consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. What that means is we have a series of programs and services that help people adopt various clean energy technologies. Today, we're obviously talking about electric cars, but we've also got programs on solar and wind and heat pumps and energy efficiency. And we also do public policy advocacy work in both our states to make sure that we've got policies on the books and are actually executing on them that will help us meet our emissions reductions goals. So you're talking today to the Drive Green team. We've got a program called Drive Green that helps people make the switch to electric vehicles, and this webinar is one of those resources. My name is Anna Vandersbeck. I am our electric vehicle program director, and I'll be the speaker today, but I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Elise. I'm Anna's Drive Green intern for the summer, and I will be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can put them there.
Awesome. Thanks, Elise. So as Elise said, we've got a Q&A function. So a couple of reminders about Zoom. You will be muted throughout the webinar today, but we absolutely want to encourage your participation. So please do go ahead and put any questions you have in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to use closed captions, you can also click CC at the bottom of your screen, and then text will appear underneath me as I speak. And we will absolutely share both the slides and a recording after the webinar today. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about 4 things. We're going to start with a quick review of some charging basics just to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to key terms. We're going to dive a little deeper into DC fast charging because we're talking about charging on the go today. And a lot of times when people have questions about that, it's really about DC fast charging. Then we'll show you how to find public charging and plan a road trip. And we'll end with sort of report out on the status of public charging build out, which I know is a popular topic right now. But we'll go ahead and dive right into a review of charging basics. If you attended our webinar on charging basics, we spent a lot of time, or not a lot of time, but we reviewed some high school science and talked about different key terms when it comes to electricity. Today, for today's webinar, there's really 2 terms that are important to understand to make sure that the rest of this presentation makes sense. The first is power. So when we're talking about charging up an electric vehicle, an easy metaphor to use is filling a bucket with water flowing through a pipe. Power refers to how fast a car can charge, and that's really the flow of water coming out through the pipe. So if it's a really big pipe and the water's moving really fast, you've got a higher power level and that bucket will be filled faster. Similarly, if you've got a higher powered charger, the electricity is going to get into that battery faster and the battery or the bucket will fill up more quickly. So if you hear me talking about anything in terms of kilowatts, I'm talking about power. Energy is a measure of how much work something can do. And I'm realizing there's a typo in this slide, so apologies about that. But the amount of kilowatt hours that a battery holds is equivalent to how many drops of water are in that bucket. The more kilowatt hours are in that vehicle, the farther it can go. So kilowatts is power, kilowatt hours is energy. Realistically, most of this presentation today will be talking about power and kilowatts. Similarly, some other quick terms. When I say charger, when anybody says charger, most people think of the thing that you plug your vehicle into, and that's how most people use it when they're just talking. But technically speaking, that unit that you're plugging your car into is actually called electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE. And it's basically just equipment that safely transfers electricity from your home or the grid to your vehicle. Technically speaking, when we talk about a charger, we're talking about a thing built right into your vehicle that converts power from a wall outlet that's flowing in AC or alternating current and converts it into DC power to put into the battery. This is just a heads up so that if you see the term EVSE anywhere or it comes up, that you remember, okay, that means the thing I plug my car into. But I, like most people, will talk about charging stations as chargers, even though we know that really the charger is a thing built into the car, but that's not how people really talk about EVs. Next, if you were at our Charging Basics webinar, we covered the different plug types in great detail, and this is a theme we'll come back to throughout this presentation today. But just at the outset, wanted to remind us all that for electric cars, there's a couple different levels of charging. Really, most people use level 2 or DC fast charging, which some people call level 3. Level 2 charging usually happens through a port that's called the J1772. And DC fast charging is currently split into 3 different standards: the CHAdeMO, the CCS, and the Tesla. But that is all changing over time. But right now, this slide serves as a reminder that, okay, there's different levels of charging, and right now there's different plug types, and they look different, but we'll go into more detail on like how this actually works when you're driving. So with that, we're going to start with DC fast charging, because when most people are thinking about finding charging on the go, they're thinking about going on a road trip. And if you're going on a road trip, you're probably going to want to use DC fast charging. So DC fast charging is a little bit different than level 2 charging in terms of what's actually happening in the vehicle. So in the couple slides ago, when I was talking about EVSE versus chargers, I mentioned that there's an onboard charger, which you can see in the blue on the left side of the screen, that is converting AC power to DC power to put it into the battery. When you're using a DC fast charger or a level 3 charger, the electricity is coming into the vehicle already as DC. So it doesn't have to go through an onboard charger, it goes straight into the battery. And DC fast charging is unique in that it can deliver a lot more power. So you can see here on this graphic, the DC charging is 50 kilowatts as opposed to 3.6 to 11 kilowatts. But modern DC fast chargers can go all the way up to 350 kilowatts, which we'll talk about more. So DC fast charging, some people call it level 3, is the closest equivalent to stopping at a gas station, and that you get a lot of miles very quickly. How quickly is the big question with DC fast charging? And unfortunately, this is a question with an answer that is, it depends. And it depends on a lot of different things. So the first thing that matters when you're thinking about how fast you can charge is how many kilowatts your vehicle can accept. So some vehicles can charge only at 75 kilowatts. Other vehicles can charge at 350. The greater that number, the faster you're going to be able to charge. With that said, it also matters what the power output of the station that you're plugged into. So if you have a vehicle that can receive power at 350 kilowatts, but you're plugged into a station that can only dispense 100, you're not going to be able to charge at 350. You're always going to go with the lower of the two. So when you see an electric vehicle advertised as it will add this many miles in this many minutes, that's always assuming that you're at a station that has a max output that meets what your vehicle can take in. But a lot of stations don't necessarily deliver 350 kilowatts. Another thing that really matters in terms of how fast an EV can charge is the battery's state of charge, which basically means how full is it already. And I'll talk about that in a whole slide all to itself, because that's a really important topic. the temperature or the air temperature really matters. The main time this matters is when it's very, very cold. If it's very, very cold, and by that I mean under 20 degrees Fahrenheit, when you plug into a DC fast charger, the first thing it's going to do is charge slowly to warm the battery up to the right temperature. And then once the battery is at an optimal temperature, it will ramp up charging closer to the maximum that the vehicle can accept. That just means that because you're charging a little bit slower at the beginning, your whole charging period is a little slower. If you're interested in this, we've got a whole webinar all about winter driving that we have recorded that I'm happy to share with you because that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But just for now, the weather does impact how fast you can charge. And then in terms of how quickly you can charge and what that means for how far you can drive, it also matters how big your battery is because it's obviously going to take longer to fill a bigger battery than a smaller battery. And it also matters what the vehicle's efficiency is. So if you can charge really quick, but the vehicle is giant and takes a lot of kilowatt hours to move a mile, then how many miles you add per minute might be different from a vehicle that's got smaller battery and is very efficient, but maybe charges a little bit more slowly. So it can be a little overwhelming for me to tell you all these things. You do not need to know how all these things interact because there are tools I'll show you later that can help you figure out if you're planning a road trip, how long you should stop and where you should plan to charge. But this is just the purpose of this slide is to illustrate that DC fast charging in particular is a little bit more complicated than level 1 or level 2. With those other chargers, as we saw in our previous presentation, it's a little easier to just sort of say it's so many miles per hour spent charging. DC fast charging, these various factors really impact the speed. So I mentioned, excuse me, while I try to change the slide, that there's really a wide range in terms of electric vehicles and how quickly they can charge when using DC fast charging. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list. This is not every electric vehicle that's out there, but it is a series of vehicles whose max charging rate is 50 kilowatts apart. So we start at the top, the 2025 GMC Sierra EV, which is a very large vehicle. It's got a battery size of 200 kilowatt hours. It has a max charging rate of 350 kilowatts, which is right now pretty much the max charging rate in the US market. It's got a range of 400 miles, and if you Google what the manufacturer or what dealers say in terms of how quickly you can add range when DC fast charging, they say, okay, you're going to be able to add 100 miles in 10 minutes on average. There's always the little asterisk on average because it depends on the weather and the state of charge and all that, but 100 miles in 10 minutes. If we then go all the way down to the bottom of the graph, we've got the 2025 Kia Niro EV. It has a much smaller battery. It's only 64.8 kilowatt hours. Still gets 253 miles per charge, but the charging rate is only 75 kilowatts. And so if you're charging there, they say you can get from 10 to 80% of the vehicle's range in about 45 minutes. So as you go down from 350 to 300 to 250 to 200, you can see that the charging speed kind of slows. But another thing you can see is that there is not a standard way of explaining how fast charging happens. Different manufacturers take different routes. Some of them, it's kind of hard to find the information in terms of how fast DC fast charging happens. So when I send out these slides, you can see what our sources for all of this are, all of these facts are, but some manufacturers like to say, okay, how long does it take to get from 10 to 80%? Others like to say, how many miles do you add in 10 minutes? It's very hard to do an apples to apples comparison for these different vehicles, but the basic point is the higher the charging rate, the faster you'll charge, and the more efficient the vehicle, the more those kilowatt hours translate into actual movement. So I'm not going to go through every single line of this graphic, but I will show you later how to find this as you're shopping for different vehicles. And this again is basically a measure of how full the battery is when you're already plugged in. So in our other webinars, we talk a lot about the battery management systems in these vehicles. These vehicles have really sophisticated regulating systems for the battery, and one of the primary purposes of those systems is to reduce heat. Because the more heat there is in the battery, the more quickly the batteries degrade over the life of the vehicle. So one of the primary functions of these battery management systems is to make sure that you're charging at a rate that does not introduce unnecessary heat into the battery. And so we have on the left here a graph that's called a DC fast charging curve, courtesy of some company named Avesco. But basically on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we've got the state of charge, and then on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we've got the power output. So you can see that if you start charging at 0% full, you pretty quickly ramp up to a high power output. So you might start, if this is one of the vehicles that gets like 200, can do a max of 200 kilowatts, you might start at 25 and slowly ramp up over the first couple of minutes to reach that top charging speed for that electric vehicle and charging station. Then as you get from, let's say, 20% or 10% to 80%, the charging or the power output slowly decreases, again, to manage the heat and make sure that we're not overheating the battery or charging it too quickly. But then when we get to 80%, that's when the charging speed pretty dramatically slows. And again, that is to protect the battery. So if you are on a road trip and you plug in at 20%, you're going to be pretty efficient in terms of number of miles you're adding per time that you're spending at that station. But if you plug in when you're at 75% at DC fast charging, it's not going to charge very quickly compared to what it would be if the battery were emptier. What this means for you if you're driving is basically don't use a DC fast charger if you're just topping off. It's better to spend down that energy, basically empty the battery a little bit more, and then go to a DC fast charger. And one of the tools I'll show later that shows you how to plan a trip will do that math for you and tell you where to stop for how long based on your starting point, your destination, and the vehicle that you drive. So just keep in mind, after 80%, things get really slow. Another way of looking at that is to look at a sort of sample charging session for a Chevy Bolt. So if we have this sort of fictional Chevy Bolt and we plug it in at 5% charge, it's going to add like 100 miles in the first 30 minutes. And I should note the Chevy Bolt is one of the slower charging vehicles. So if this were that GMC Sierra EV, this would be a lot faster. But for the Bolt, first half hour, you add 100 miles. Great. And the next half hour, you're getting from 43% to 74% full. You're going to add a little bit less. You're only going to add 90 miles in that half hour. And then once you hit that 74 or 80%, you could be there for a full other hour and only add 50 miles, where in the first hour that you were there, you added almost 200. And so that is another way of looking at the same charging curve of basically things really slow down once you get to 75, 80% to protect the battery. So I mentioned earlier, or we saw earlier, that there are those three charging plug types right now. There's CCS, CHAdeMO, and what is known as the North American Charging Standard, or NACS. NACS is basically what used to be the proprietary Tesla charging port, which is no longer proprietary. Every major auto manufacturer has made an agreement with Tesla that they're all going to start using that same technology. And the American market basically is in the process of transitioning. So some manufacturers have adapters available. So you can purchase an adapter and that will allow you as a non-Tesla driver to use a Tesla DC fast charging station. And some manufacturers that aren't Tesla have already started building that NACS port into new vehicles. And we'll show you which ones that is in a couple slides. If you spend any time on like inside EVs or electric or any of these sort of EV nerd subreddits, you might see NACS referred to as J3400. but we'll refer to it as NACS. That's that North American charging standard. So what are the benefits of this whole transition to NACS? The first one is simplicity. So the same NACS plug is used for level 1, level 2, and DC fast charging. Previously, you had sort of one plug and one port for level 1 and level 2, and one plug and one port for DC fast charging. That's confusing. NACS just all uses one port. NACS is also physically easier to engage. Some of the CCS combo charger is quite hefty, but the NACS one is smaller and just easier to maneuver. The key thing is that there's going to be less confusion. A couple years from now, we will not need to worry about whether the port on your car matches the port on the charging station that you're going to, because they're just all going to be using the same one. Right now, some are NACS, some are CHAdeMO, some are CCS. There are tools that are easy to use that you can use to figure out which one's which. But as we transition to NACS, that's just going to become less and less of a headache. And then finally, access. So there are a lot of public charging stations out there. Many of them are Tesla charging stations, many of them are not. But the fact that this transition is happening means that all drivers can access all of these charging stations. And Tesla has invested in a really robust charging network of what they call superchargers, which are basically just DC fast charging stations all across the country. So this does open up EV access to folks in parts of the country where there maybe aren't as many non-Tesla charging stations. They can buy a non-Tesla vehicle, but still use those charging stations. So overall, this is definitely good for EV drivers, regardless of what vehicle they drive. So I mentioned that some manufacturers have these adapters. These things are physical units that get shipped to you or you buy at a dealership, and they basically on the one end plug into your vehicle's charging port, and on the other end plug into the plug at a public DC fast charging station. At this point, they're available for purchase from most, but not all manufacturers. But one thing I really want to stress is make sure you buy, if you're getting a NACS adapter, get the one from your manufacturer. There are third-party adapters available online. There's some that are more reputable and others that, quite frankly, are pretty sketchy and are on eBay or places like that. But the key thing is that if you buy one of these third-party adapters and use it, you may void your vehicle's warranty. And so that alone is a good reason to make sure you're using equipment that's been approved by the manufacturer in case anything goes wrong. So as I mentioned, different manufacturers are in different stages of having these adapters available. They were all supposed to be available by now, but general economic uncertainty and tariffs and just also general delays by manufacturers have left us in this situation where some manufacturers are there and others aren't. So on the left, you can see a list of manufacturers that do have the adapters available. We've put the prices here. In many cases, if you purchased your vehicle before a certain date, you may be able to get it for free. So you should check your manufacturer if you're already driving an EV for that detail. And then some manufacturers, specifically Kia and Rivian, are basically handing out these adapters with eligible vehicle purchases. So it depends a little bit on the car and the model year, but you'll just get an adapter with your vehicle. On the right, we've got a list of manufacturers who do not yet have, excuse me, those adapters available. When you look this up, you see a lot of announcements from 2023 about when those will be available, but nothing more recent. So hopefully those are coming soon, but it's a little bit of a waiting game for those manufacturers. As I mentioned earlier, there are an increasing number of non-Tesla vehicles that will be built with a native, quote, native NACS port, which means the port will be built right into the vehicle, so you don't need to worry about an adapter. These are the ones that we're aware of now. There are probably more announcements coming all the time, like the Rivian R1T, R1S. I don't know if it's even been formally announced yet, but some sleuths on the internet noticed that in a promotional video for the 2026 vehicle, there was a NACS port, not a CCS. So that's coming soon. But you can see there's a pretty wide range. The 2025 Hyundai Ioniq 5 is very popular and available now. And then for some of these, they're either slightly more expensive or not yet available like at dealerships. But this list will definitely grow over time. If you find all this a little bewildering and would like some help figuring out which vehicles have what, I want to make a quick plug, and pun intended, to use our EV Finder. So we've got a resource on our website that you can find at evfinder.greenenergyconsumers.org that allows you to sort and filter all the vehicles that we're aware of being on the market right now based on the status of the transition to NACS, the charging rate, and other factors. So here, for example, is a screenshot. You can see the 2025 Hyundai Kona Electric. You can see that its DC fast charging rate is 100 kilowatts, that it's got the CCS DC fast charging port built in, but that it does have an adapter available. So if you're looking for a vehicle and you're like, I only want a vehicle if there's an adapter available, you can filter by that. If you want to only see vehicles that have a high DC fast charging rate, you can sort by that, or you can filter and say, only show me ones that charge over 200 kilowatts. We hope our intention with this tool is to really help you narrow down your choices, because we are at a point now where there's dozens and dozens of electric vehicles that you could be considering. And this tool is meant to help you narrow down that list. I do want to quickly mention one other thing that you might have heard of in the DC fast charging space, and that is the Tesla, quote, magic dock. So right before basically this transition to NACS started, Tesla had started outfitting some, but not all, of its superchargers with a built-in adapter so that you can roll up, like in this picture on the left, that's a Chevy Bolt. You can roll up and say, I'd like to use a CCS port, and it will basically attach an adapter for you when you pull the cord out. This is only available for CCS vehicles. There aren't any CHAdeMO magic docks, and they're not particularly widespread. There are some, and there's a map on the right there of the stations that we could find. It might be something you come across in your travels, but just we wanted to make sure you'd heard of the term magic dock before the night is through here. So lastly, in our sort of deep dive into DC fast charging, a lot of people will ask, okay, how much does DC fast charging cost? And I'll show you in a moment how to find out exactly how much charging costs at a particular charging station. But in general, DC fast charging costs more than level 2 because you're paying for the power and convenience. It is more expensive for a site host to install a DC fast charger and to operate a DC fast charger, so they're passing some of those costs on to you. The costs do vary by station, and you can see in advance how much charging will cost on the various apps and websites that we'll talk through. Some stations have different charges based on your power draw. So if you drive a vehicle that only is going to draw 60 kilowatts, you might see a different charge than a vehicle that draws 200 kilowatts, in addition to having a per kilowatt hour fee. And then some stations may have different rates for different times of day. That's less true in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but might be true other places that you're traveling. Some stations may charge you for continuing to be plugged in even once your car is charged. And then some offer like subscription or membership models where you pay a little bit per month, but then you pay a lower rate when you actually go to use the charging station. We looked at a resource from Investopedia that basically said, in general, DC fast charging rates are between 30 and 48 cents per kilowatt hour. I've definitely seen higher in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but I think that's a general good range. And that will result in somewhere between $10 and $30 per hour, depends on how quickly your car charges. If you charge at home in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, you're likely paying somewhere between 25 and 35 cents per kilowatt hour. So to put that into perspective, if we assume you're driving a Chevy Equinox EV, which is a great car, affordable, qualifies for all of the incentives from the federal government and the state, if you wanted to go 100 miles and your home electricity cost was 30 cents a mile, that would cost you $7.98. If you're DC fast charging and it's 45 cents a kilowatt hour, it would cost you almost 12. So you can see that slight difference. So I've talked a lot about DC fast charging in general, but how do you actually find a charging station? And how do you plan a road trip? That's what this section is about. So the first thing to know is that there are many different charging network companies that are building out both level 2 and DC fast charging all across the country. There's a really long list, but some common companies you might see in this region are ChargePoint, EV Connect, EVgo, Electrify America, Switch, Tesla, Flow. That can be a little bewildering. Each one of these companies has their own app and their own map that you can use to find charging stations. But the good news is that many of these companies have enabled interoperability, which basically means that the backend systems talk to each other. So you can, for example, as an EVgo customer, use the EVgo app to operate a ChargePoint charging station. So if you have an EV and as you start to charge in public, you'll figure out which stations are the ones that you use the most, and maybe you'll download those apps. But if you go on a longer road trip, for example, you can use, you're likely able to use an app you already have, even if you're not a member of whatever charging network company you're stopping at. How do you actually use a public charger? First, you locate it, and I'll show you how to do that with some popular apps in the next couple of slides. Then you plug the charging cord into your vehicle or into your adapter if you're using a NACS adapter. Then you start the charging session, and there's a couple different ways to do this. You can use your app, like in the picture on the top right. You can often start it from your vehicle, or you can start it from the charging station. You might also have an RFID card that you can tap to start the charging session. Depends a little bit on which network you're using. Then you can monitor the charging station from your network's app, your vehicle's app, or your vehicle's dashboard. So on the right, you've got a picture of what EVgo might report to you. It will show you a graph on the right of like, okay, you started charging at 12:36 p.m. You finished at 1:18 p.m. The maximum power that you reached was somewhere around 80 kilowatts. This is the percent full that your battery is currently. It'll give you lots of data like that. And then at the end, you pay for the session, which often happens either directly through the app, through the charger, or through an RFID card, and increasingly a lot of these stations have credit card tap options as well. So how do you actually find a charger? There are a couple options. So each charging network, as I mentioned, has their own app or website that you can use to find chargers, but there are also network neutral apps that we'll cover. But these apps can help you find the actual charging station in terms of its address, but also once you get there, like find it in the parking lot, which surprisingly is sometimes a little challenging. Often these websites will have a photo uploaded by other users, so you can figure out, okay, the charging station is by the big tree in the back of the parking lot or something like that. So we definitely recommend poking around before you get there. The two apps that we recommend as a good starting point are PlugShare and a Better Route Planner. These apps will tell you where chargers are located, how many stations there are, and how many ports there are, what kinds of plugs are available, how much it costs to charge, if there's a charge for parking. They'll tell you the power level of the station. They'll tell you if there's anything nearby, like a bathroom or a coffee shop. In some cases, they'll tell you whether someone is already plugged in. And again, users and PlugShare in particular can upload pictures, or they can check in and say, okay, I charged today and it worked great, or I tried to charge today and the station was down. You can kind of see a recent history of visits at the charging station. Both apps also offer trip planning capabilities to different levels of detail, but we'll show you a couple screenshots of what that looks like. So this is PlugShare. These are two screenshots we took from PlugShare. The app, as you can tell, is not the shiniest, but basically it will show you all the public charging stations available near any address that you type in, and it's the kind of resource where as you zoom in, more will pop up. But anything that is in green on these maps is a level 2 charging station. Anything that is orange is a DC fast charging station. And anything that has a picture of a little wrench is either being repaired or is in the process of being built. And when you click on any of these little flags, it'll pop up and show you price, the location, pictures, all that information that I just covered. PlugShare does have a route planning tool where you can put a start point and an end point and basically say how far off your route you'd be willing to drive to charge. But when we talk to EV drivers, they mostly recommend using a better route planner to plan a longer trip. So to sort of show you what this app can do, we're going to pretend that we're taking a trip from Jamaica Plain, where our Boston office is, to Acadia National Park, because that's a beautiful place to be at this time of year. So basically you start by putting in your stops. So in this case, we're saying from JP to Acadia, back to JP again. And then you also put in specifically what vehicle you're driving. So here we're saying we're going to use the 2024 Hyundai Ioniq 5. And you say what the starting state of charge is. So we're assuming that at the beginning of this trip, we're 90% charged. Then you put in what your preferences are. So you can say, I want to make sure that I reach my destination with at least 60% state of charge. You can toggle that all the way down to 10 or put it all the way up to 100, whatever you're comfortable with and what you need once you get to your destination. And then you can also tell it whether you want to optimize for the quickest arrival or fewer stops but make them longer, or shorter stops but have them more, really just depending on how you like to travel. And then when you hit plan, it will spit out basically a map for you. So it will figure out, based on your preferences, what the best route is for you. So for this example, we're assuming we've got a 2024 Hyundai Ioniq 5 and that we have an AX adapter. It has found a couple different places for us to charge along the way. It says generally it takes about 5 hours to get to Acadia. If you're going to make these 5 stops, that's going to add an hour and a half. But a lot of these stops are in places where you might want to stop anyway to use the restroom or get a snack or walk the dog or whatever it is that you need to do. So for each stop along the path, it will tell you exactly how long to be there. So this in the screenshot in the middle, you can see, okay, we start at JP at 90%. We drive for 2 hours and 12 minutes. And then in Freeport, Maine, there's a Rivian charging station that we can use. We'll start charging at 26%. We'll stay there for 13 minutes and go all the way up to 62%. And then we're back on our merry way. So the way that we set this up in this example, each charging session there and back will take less than 20 minutes, long enough, again, to get up, find a bathroom, find a cup of coffee. And then on the right, you can see exactly where all those stops are. So a better route planner is definitely a great tool to play around with. If there's any road trips that you want to be able to make in an EV, you can see what your options are and sort of play around with what your preferences might be to see what it spits back out to you. This is our last section. We're going to talk about the status of the public charging network right now, because this is definitely a top topic. So big picture, much of the charging infrastructure that is being built out at this point that is public is being built out with at least some support from federal, state, utility, or other programs. It's not all public charging, but a fair amount does have some level of support, particularly for DC fast charging. But I will say that the industry and the market is always rapidly changing. So a couple of years ago, when we were giving this kind of presentation, the max charging rate was 150 kilowatts, and now we've got 350 on the market. So this is a space that is really actively changing. Looking at the big picture, the bad news is that we are in particularly uncertain times with the federal administration that is actively pushing back the transition to electric vehicles, and I'll talk about that more in the next slide. But the good news is that there is a lot of innovation and investment happening despite that federal landscape. So starting at the federal level, I'm sure you've all seen the articles in the news. The Trump administration has definitely made slowing the transition to electric vehicles a priority. They halted disbursements for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, also known as NEVI, and the future of that program is now uncertain. So Massachusetts was supposed to receive $63.6 million over 5 years as part of this NEVI program. The state has accessed all the funds that it should be allowed to access at this point, actually. So given how the sort of phases of the program work, at this point, it should have received $50 million and it has received $50 million. So in Massachusetts, the NEVI program is ongoing, the installations are happening. We just don't know what's going to happen to those remaining $13.6 million that were supposed to come later down the line. Rhode Island was supposed to receive $22.7 million, so far has only received 1.8, and so there's $20.9 million whose future is uncertain in Rhode Island. In addition, the Trump administration has stopped funds that were allocated through the Community Fueling and Infrastructure Grant, or CFI grant. This was a competitive grant. Rhode Island, for example, was due to receive $15 million to build out charging in disadvantaged communities, and that is completely on hold. In both cases, the future of these programs will likely be fought out in court. Technically speaking, because Congress allocated these funds and Congress has the power of the purse, the executive branch can't just pull the plug on a program like this without Congress changing the law. So this will likely end up in the courts and be fought out over much too long a time period. So this is the context that we're operating in. But federal funds aren't everything. So in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, there's various programs that you can cobble together to support the build out of public charging. There is unfortunately more of that kind of thing in Massachusetts than in Rhode Island. Massachusetts has a program called EVIP that offers funds for the build out of public charging. Rhode Island does not have an equivalent program at this time. Rhode Island does have a program that funds the build out of charging at home and at multi-family homes, but nothing for public charging. In Massachusetts, our investor-owned utilities have big programs. They got approved to spend $400 million building out EV charging programs, EV chargers back in 2022. The particular bucket that was for public charging infrastructure is fully subscribed in those programs. But right now, the Department of Public Utilities is weighing potential midterm changes to that program, which is supposed to run for another 2 years. So it may be that some funding gets shifted from other buckets so that we can continue to have that support for public charging build out. And then the private sector is doing a lot of work in this space. In particular, I want to point to Tesla, which is continuing to build out charging stations, but also Iona, which I'll have a whole slide on, which is basically other automakers working together to build out charging stations. And then for better or for worse, there are oil companies that are in this space. Shell has bought up EV charging companies over the past couple of years. BP has a sort of sub-brand called BP Pulse. They just opened a new DC fast charging hub with 20 slots near Logan Airport. And that kind of work is going to keep happening and impact this space. I mentioned Iona, I still don't know how to pronounce it. This is a joint project of several different automakers that are listed here that was launched only in February of 2024. They are building what they're calling rechargeries, which are basically EV charging installations, but with canopies, lighting, seating, bathrooms, vending machines, other amenities to really make it a much more pleasant experience to have to charge on the go. So far, they've opened just a couple of these stations. They've contracted with 100 sites across the country, and their goal is to install 1,000 ports by the end of this year and 30,000 in the next 5 years. And they are putting billions of dollars into this. So I share this to say NEVI is not the whole story by any means. There's a lot of investment coming into this space from all sorts of angles. Finally, I want to also point to the fact that states are planning. And unfortunately, this is another case where there's more to say in Massachusetts than in Rhode Island. Massachusetts has an Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Coordinating Council, or EVIC, which is basically an interagency council that's bringing together a lot of different state agencies to really tackle the question of, okay, how are we going to build out enough charging to enable 900,000 electric vehicles by 2030? That's in our clean energy and climate plan to meet our climate requirement of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. We need 900,000 of the 5.4 million vehicles in Massachusetts to be electric by 2030. And to do that, EVIC is figuring out how many charging stations do we need and where. So on the right, I have a screenshot from the most recent EVIC meeting, actually 2 EVIC meetings ago in May. This was sort of their preliminary analysis of where we're going to need DC fast charging ports, but they've also got this analysis for level 2 charging ports and have a lot more granularity available in those slides if you're curious. The next step for EVIC is to deliver a report to the legislature in August that basically sets the plan for the next 5 to 10 years on EV charging. So that's something we as Green Energy Consumers Alliance are engaged in. We go to all the EVIC meetings and say our piece, but it's also something that you are welcome to engage in as a resident of Massachusetts. All those meetings are public. And then lastly, there's a lot of innovation happening in this space. So the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts, is funding pilot programs around different aspects of EV charging that need some innovation. So there's a program around curbside charging. There's a program about charging for Uber, Lyft, and taxi drivers specifically that we are also engaged on in terms of the outreach and education arm for that project. They're working on a mobile charging program for fleets and vehicle to grid integration to basically use electric vehicles as batteries on the grid. And the city of Boston is doing lots of cool stuff with curbside charging, including piloting a new model for curbside charging, which is really widespread in Europe, but is new to the US, where instead of having a charging station with a cord, it's a charging station and you, the driver, bring your own cord. And so they're piloting that with a company called It's Electric, which is really exciting. Some stations are up and running around the city of Boston. So I want to leave you with the feeling that there is a lot of investment and exciting stuff happening in this space, because there is. I mentioned this earlier, but if you want to learn more about the different vehicles, we have an EV Finder that has lots of information about charging, but also lots of information about incentives and range, and you can sort and filter by different characteristics to find your favorite vehicles, and then you can check those off and sign up, and we'll keep an eye out for you. And if we hear something exciting about a vehicle that you've been interested in, we'll send you an email and let you know that there's a new release date, or there's really good lease deals right now, or anything like that that you might be interested in. But with that, we've reached the end of the webinar. So I know there's been a lot of questions popping up, so I'll go through these last slides real quick, but we've got lots of upcoming events. Please come to them. You can see the list at greenenergyconsumers.org/events. We are a nonprofit organization, and we really want to make content like this available for free. So if you are willing and able, we are always grateful for any donation that you can share with us so that we can keep doing more of what needs to be done to meet our climate goals in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. If you want to learn more about EVs, we've got a Drive Green community Facebook group, we've got a newsletter, we've got a pledge you can sign. We'll send all that information in a follow-up email. And then lastly, if you have any questions, I'm going to go through the questions now, but if I don't get to your question, please feel free to email me or my colleague Caroline. She would be with us normally, but she's on vacation. So you can email either of us and we'll get back to you. But with that, I'm going to see what questions I can find. Please hold. Okay. Thank you, Elise, for going through these questions. Okay. So there is one question about conditioning the battery. So some of you may have heard of preconditioning of a vehicle, which basically means if it's really cold and you are about to go on a trip, you can turn on the vehicle and heat the cabin while the vehicle's still plugged in. And then when you go off to drive, it's nice and cozy and you haven't wasted any of the energy that was stored in the battery to do that. There's an equivalent preconditioning of the battery if you're going to DC fast charge. That is a different, it's not heating the cabin or the seat or the steering wheel, it's heating the battery. And that is something that the vehicle is gonna do for you. So it's a relatively new feature, so not all vehicles can do this. Some vehicles are smart enough that if you tell them on your sort of in-vehicle navigation that you're going to a DC fast charger, they will start preconditioning the battery for you. Others, you need to manually turn it on and off. The question is, how long should you do that before you get to the station? And I honestly don't know the answer. So we will find out for you. I'm sure that's in the like user manuals of those vehicles, but because it's so new of a feature, I haven't actually done it myself, so I don't know. Second question is, do you recommend charging over the 80% recommended max charge to 90% or even 100% before going on a long trip? Yes. So if you know you're going on a long trip and you are charging at a level 2 charger before you head out, absolutely go up to 100%. I think a lot of times when you talk about EVs, people say don't charge up to 100% because in general, you want to stay between 20 and 80%. But if you're going on a road trip, the 100% is there for a reason. And even when it says that it's at 100% charge, the manufacturers have always built in a little buffer. So you can't actually completely charge to 100% because they're protecting the battery. So before a long trip, absolutely charge above 80%. It's just when you're sitting at a DC fast charger, maybe you don't need to go above 80%, and a better route planner will help you figure that out. Then there's a question about why don't more gas stations offer chargers? Is there a safety issue with putting chargers near gas pumps? There's not a safety issue putting chargers near gas pumps. You'll see that some DC fast chargers are located at rest stops that have gas stations as well. I can't speak to why there aren't more chargers at gas stations. Gas stations make most of their money off of not the selling you the gas, but the fact that while you're getting gas, you go in and get a drink and some chips or things like that. It's a very low margin business on the actual fuel side. And to me, that's always meant that like it seems like a natural fit to have an EV charger there because if you're charging your EV, you're much more likely to go in and buy a snack or something. I don't know why there aren't more. I think in other parts of the world, in Europe, there's a lot more of that co-locating. It just hasn't caught on here yet, and maybe that'll change with time. There's a clarifying question about the relationship between the utilities and the charging stations. When I talk about the utilities having programs to help build out charging, they don't own the charging stations. What they do is depending on the station and the location, they pay for the grid upgrades that might be needed or the infrastructure upgrades. So if you need to lay conduit, they'll cover the costs of basically bringing electric service to the actual place that you're going to install the charger. And then in certain types of places and in environmental justice communities, they might have a rebate for the installation of the charger themselves. All of that is rate-based, so that's paid for by a very small fee on your electric bill, and that is governed by the Department of Public Utilities, but they do not own the charging stations, and I don't think they want to. Then there's a question about knowing in real time. Actually, let me read this question. I think there's a question about like knowing how full your vehicle is when it's charging. And yes, so there's two ways of doing that. One is you can use the app of the charging station itself, and it will usually communicate that to you. But you may also be able to get that information from an app for your vehicle. So there's a lot of apps involved here. But between those two things, you should be able to literally, like, you could be sitting in a coffee shop and watching your battery get full. So you don't need to sit in the vehicle watching it get full. Um, there's a question about how soon do you need to order a NACS adapter to, actually, let me see. There's a comment about like the NACS adapters, they're pretty expensive. They are. They're definitely a couple $100s, but they do open up access to a lot more charging, and it really depends on how you use your vehicle to see if that makes sense for you. There is a question about how soon those adapters get to you. I think it really depends. Over the past couple months, we've seen manufacturers have delays and then not have delays, or it's been a little bit of a wild west, and I think some of that has to do with the tariffs because they definitely impact all of this. So I unfortunately don't have a straight answer on like how fast you'll get one. But if you go through your manufacturer, I'm sure they'll tell you. Then there's a question about, do some Tesla chargers only allow Teslas to charge at them? What would happen if you brought a vehicle with a NACS adapter to a Tesla only charger? So Tesla's charging network has these superchargers, and it also has level 2 chargers. When we're talking about the adapters, we're talking about the superchargers. And you can see right on the Tesla app which ones are available. I have not heard of any superchargers that are not available to other users. I think Tesla wants more people to buy more kilowatt hours of electricity at their charging stations. So I don't think that they're excluding any particular stations. The exception might be if like a private site host has a charging station that's not open to the public at all. But I don't think there's very many of those. There's a general question of what happens if you run out of miles when you're on the road. Does AAA have a giant portable battery? Do you need to get a tow? So the first thing I want to say is that it is very, very rare that you will run out of miles when you're on the road. The vehicles, as I mentioned, have really sophisticated battery management software. And what that means is when you're driving at all times on the screen, it will tell you you've got this many miles of range yet left. And it will adjust that figure based on, are you driving on the highway or are you driving in stop and go traffic? Are you blasting the heat or using the more efficient options of the heated steering wheel and the heated seat? So you're never going to suddenly only have 5 miles of range left. But to answer the question, AAA will come tow you to a charging station. I think they're piloting some mobile chargers. But we talk to the AAA folks every now and then, and I think the main thing is that they tow you to a charger. Then somebody's clearly on all the fun EV websites out there and reporting that BYD, which is a Chinese company, which has actually overtaken Tesla in terms of selling the most EVs worldwide. A couple months ago, there was an article that they have vehicles that can charge a really high rate, like 200, 300 miles in 5 minutes. Is that coming to the US? No. I mean, maybe eventually, but not anytime soon. I think every now and then there are news articles like that about somebody charging really fast, and sometimes it's a startup and you're like not really sure they can bring this to scale. I do think it's significant that BYD is the one that made that announcement because they absolutely can bring it to scale, but they can't currently sell any of their vehicles in the United States. And the way that international trade talks and tariffs are going, I don't think that they'll be able to do that anytime soon. But this is an example of how the US is slow walking on EVs, is leaving a competitive advantage to other manufacturers. And so BYD is developing these really cool fast charging vehicles that they can sell in China, but can also sell in Europe and in Africa and in South America, while our manufacturers are not quite as caught up. So definitely exciting, but I don't expect to see it here anytime soon. Okay, I see that it is 8 o'clock and I see that there are lots more questions. Let me just see. Elise, is there any that jumps out to you that I should end on? Or have I answered them all? There's a lot of them.
I think you've answered them all.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you, Elise, for managing the Q&A so that I could find the questions quickly. Again, if we didn't answer your question, please feel free to send us an email. You'll also get a follow-up email from us later this week with the recording and the slides and a couple links to some of the resources I mentioned, but you're always welcome to email us, and I hope you all get a chance to go outside or at least sit by a window because it's very nice outside. Thank you, everyone.